Hello, everyone, and welcome to Books Undone. I'm your host, Livia J. Elliot, and today we are back with a guest talk discussing another short story by Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges. In this case, we are deep diving into the famous Tlön Uqbar Orbis Tertius. But before we start, let me introduce you to my guests today.
Oh, hi, I'm Jared. I am at the Fantasy Thinker YouTube channel. You can find me there.
Hi, I'm Vasha. You can find me on the YouTube channel Reading by the Rainy Mountain and on a speculative fiction podcast called Speculative Speculations.
Hi, I'm Jose. I run the Jose's Amazing Worlds YouTube channel, and also I host the occasional Fantasy Talks Live podcast.
Hi, I'm AP, and my YouTube channel is A Critical Dragon.
Hello, I'm Javier or Hamedi. You might know me from the site JamReads, and not much more.
Awesome. I'm honestly very happy to have you all here. But before we start, here are some disclaimers. First, as usual, there are spoilers in this podcast. We are only focusing on the short story of Tlön Uqbar Orbis Tertius, and we will not spoil other short stories in the anthologies of Ficciones or Labyrinth. We may, however, reference them briefly. Second, what you will hear is our subjective opinion about this story. You may disagree, and that's completely fine.
The thing that stood out to me was right away. He takes note of a mirror that's reflecting an encyclopedia that's supposedly a laggedly reprint of another encyclopedia. And so he has all these different levels of looking at something that don't exactly match up with each other, but yet are still mirrors of each other. That seems to be kind of the running theme going through this story that I can tell. And so that those fictional nations of Uqbar seems to be also like a mirror of our world or a nation he might live in, and also Tlön is another reflection of said places, and it's very complex connection that he makes in the story, and it takes a lot of reading through to really try to put this stuff together. But that's kind of what I got out of it right off the bat.
Yeah, like there are three levels of fiction. You have the country, then you have the world, and then you have the whole universe, which are three names and people that keep adding to it and trying to create this world for some specific reason.
There's another level of fiction, which is the story itself. So a lot of this, I think, ties into, or at least how I understand it. When you think about magic realism, the presentation of an authentic reality that contains these fantastical elements, but it's presented as real. And so it questions the nature of what is mundane, what is fantastical. What Borges does here is that to the nth degree, because it's apparently not fiction. This is meant to be a non-fiction entry. It's a non-fiction story, but it's fiction. So it's questioning the nature of reality and questioning how we define what is real and what is unreal. And when you start then applying things like a colonial lens, or in the modern day, if we talked about conspiratorial thinking, and how if you get enough people together to believe in the one thing, then that one thing actually becomes real because enough people believe in it. And he takes it even a step further about the physical manifestation of these things, because sufficient number of people believed in it and believed that they would find the thing, therefore they find the thing, therefore that is proof that the thing existed. And this circular notion of what reality is and how it is a consensus reality, and then contrasting that with the beliefs of Orbis Tertius and the people there who don't believe in nouns. They don't believe that things actually exist. So there's enormous playfulness with that very postmodern, or well, modernist and then on into postmodernist sort of deconstruction of the nature of reality. So say, this is not a pipe because it's a symbol of a pipe. And even the word pipe isn't a pipe. It's a symbol of a pipe. It goes on down the rabbit hole. So when Jared pointed out at the beginning, that image of the mirror, the image in the mirror is not the thing. But we look at it and go, that is the thing. Like, I can see it. but seeing it, it's a reflection of a thing. But then the thing that we actually see, well, that's light reflecting off something. And so it's this continual teasing away at the nature of what is actually real and how we define what is real. Even the old saw about if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, does it make a sound? And there's a line in the short story about a doorway disappeared because the beggar that used to sit in it died, and therefore the doorway was no longer perceived, therefore the doorway ceased to exist. So much of this ties into our perception of what is a nation, and that whole colonial thing about defining a people, defining a country, defining boundaries, and then the notion of a consensus reality and the function of language to shape our reality, and through the manipulation of language or the manipulation of thought, we can actually change and shape the reality. And that's why this is an amazing story that is playing on all of these different levels, because it's a story that doesn't really have a story. It's presented as non-fiction, even though it's fiction, and it's about the representation of a fictional country in an encyclopedia pertaining to be real. And that level of reality and unreality and how they play into each other is a recursive mirror that plays through all of it.
In terms of the reality and the unreality, something that I found interesting is that he uses real people as the characters. He uses his friends. So you have Berkeley, Buckley, Princess Lucinge, for what I searched for, was a friend of his, and she was real. And you have all of these real people who were actually involved in this, and you never know if the conversation really happened and he's transcribing them, or if he just imagined and wrote up. And as you say, the IP, that creates that part of that layer of reality versus unreality. And on the other hand, there is a part in the story when you get like a description of Tlön and Uqbar and how the people write and so on. And it said that they only write fantasy because their language presupposes idealism. Basically, they will imagine things into reality that actually ties into that what is real and what is not. Because if they can think something into reality, is it real or is it imagined?
I feel that at some points this kind of thought that there's a need of an observer or an entity to determine reality. I feel it's influenced by quantum physics, actually, because if I'm sure everybody remembers the Schrödinger cat, which basically means you need an observer to collapse the situation. And I feel this kind of realism where you need an entity that determines that reality can be influenced by that kind of doctrine or theory.
Yeah, there's a part in the story that says when you count something, the counting changes the value that you get, or something to that effect. And I was like, yeah, wave function collapse. I went down a rabbit hole with this story, as I think the rest of you also probably did. I found some papers in which they talked about Bohm, a theoretical physicist. He came up with a language called Rio mode, which resembles the language that Borges wrote about in this story. I didn't get far enough in the paper to see what that language was, but that was interesting. That there are a lot of physics papers that are citing this story, and that's interesting.
Well, he did have a take on math in the Library of Babel with the whole hexagons and everything, that the mirrors and the labyrinths, it's generally a common theme in Borges.
To circle back to a point, one of the things that I think crops up a lot in Borges's writing is this perception of what is real, questioning what is real. And with a lot of the history of certain parts of the world, the idea that someone can come in and go, this is now the country and I've defined the boundary and this is what the reality is. And you go, but hang on, we were here for centuries. How are you now saying that this is what a country is? Like, how have you defined that? When we look on a map, you see all of these borders. When you look at a map of the world, all of these borders, but those borders don't exist, except that they do. They both don't exist and do exist. They don't exist as physical things, except they do exist as physical things because we have agreed that they exist as physical. When we think then of political ideologies and how they can shape the perception of an event, and how so much of how we understand what is happening is this sort of narrativized version of reality. And we talk about it, oh, this is what happened, and it's a recitation of fact, but the order in which those facts are relayed, the words that we use to describe them, how we describe them, that actually changes the nature of the thing. And if we take a completely hypothetical example, a group of protesters outside a government building? Then they enter the government building in protest. Or are they storming the government building and they are insurgent? Because those two sets of facts, they pertain to exactly the same situation, but depending on the words that you've just used, one is an insurrection trying to overthrow a government, and the other are concerned citizens trying to get their government to listen. Two wildly different realities. And so much of this hinges on language and the imposition of definitions within language. And we see this in cultures, mine own included, where a colonizing force came in and went, no, that language is wrong. This is the language that you're now going to use. And so that no longer is that thing. The word for that now is tree. That is now tree. And you will refer to it as tree. And it becomes tree. And so we see how it works not only on a sort of relaying of event, but this construct actually shapes the reality in which you inhabit. And the idea that the power to do this in this story is a small group of people who have decided to do this, and the outsized impact that they have. And this idea then of a hidden, secretive elite using their power, using their ability to manipulate, and then watching it ripple through time. When we see how that reflects to, on a much more mundane level, the small group of people, say, in control of a country, or the people who are backing those people who are in control of the country, we start understanding this conspiratorial mindset, of which there is a basis in reality. And that's what makes it, and this story, so incredible, is it's playing with aspects of reality to anchor it so that the more fantastical elements become more believable, in exactly the same way that we can create conspiracies that are absolutely fantastical. But because parts of those conspiracies are actually rooted in a lived and experienced reality, it adds legitimacy to what is being discussed. And it's so easy to see then how we fool ourselves into buying into these perceptions. And once we've bought into the perception, once we've agreed to it, then that actually shapes how we see things. Because now we start seeing things that support our position in a sort of confirmation bias way. We dismiss evidence against it. We look for the evidence to support it, and we disregard evidence that comes against it. We see that again in this story of looking for these things and then not believing that, oh, well, they must have done this and this must be this, and interpreting the information that way.
It's like the saying goes, if you put up a little bit of truth in a lie, it becomes more truthful, right? And in here, Borges, by adding the people and using all of those elements of reality, is trying to make that fiction more real. And that is why when I read it, I thought of the Da Vinci Code, if I'm not sure if you read it, but it used names and things that pull up from conspiracy theories, like the Templars and all of these things that people know the name but know very little about them. So it created a worldwide phenomenon because a lot of people started to believe that it was real. And in here, they are basically trying to do the same thing to the characters within the story. At some point, they start, quote unquote, leaking items from Tlön into reality, like that heavy cone that you get at the end, just to make it seem more real, to give people clues that it actually existed.
It's like people use words to suit their reality in order to change reality in order to suit their perception, using language.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, bias is having bias or being biased is just part of what we are, part of humanity. We will all interpret what we see or what we experience based in our bias, which maybe it's both at the same time real and unreal, right? Because it changes the reality of what is happening.
But in this circumstance, it gets taken almost to an extreme, because if we were all sitting in the same room, we would all agree, like we were sitting around a table. And you go, yeah, we're all sitting around a table. But whether we see it as, oh, this is a very nice table, or this is an old table, that our perception of the table is going to be individual, but at least we agree on the fact that a table exists. But this takes it that one step further and basically posits, well, no, the table only exists because we agreed it existed. And as soon as we've left the room, it ceases to exist. The idea of this subjective perception of reality shaping the reality itself, of course, there's an element of that in how we see the world and how we interpret and understand the world. But this takes that thought experiment and goes even further with it to say, well, no, reality itself is entirely subjective and entirely created by consciousness, because it only exists if it is perceived, and through the perception it becomes real. Which, there are arguments being made about the holographic universe, and playing into concepts such as that, which my understanding of it is so basic and so reductive that it's not worth talking about. But the collapsing of waveforms in quantum theory, that I don't fully understand these things, but I can see how you can take those concepts and build on them and play with them in this sort of fictional landscape. And I suppose this is part of the reason why I tend to push back a little on people saying, oh, well, when we read, what we read and how we understand it, that's entirely subjective. And you go, yes, to a point, because we still agree that those are the words on the page. We still agree that those certain words mean certain things, that certain acts occurred in it. There is an overlap in the subjective reading, and that overlap is generally generated by the text. But if we divorce that entirely, and it's only what we understand is what the text is, then we have divorced meaning from the actual text, because now meaning is entirely free floating in the person perceiving it, and it has nothing to do with the actual text itself. And this sort of argument and idea that Borges is playing with, and sort of bringing it to the most absurd degree. And that's the issue. When we analyze text, when we look at the world, when we look at information, there will be elements that will change, quite radically in certain circumstances. But ultimately, we still try to agree on a baseline. And once we've divorced the baseline reality from the meaning inherent in that, and it's now entirely a subjective understanding of that meaning, and that then is transferred back to correct the source material, that's where we end up with politicians stating things about alternative facts and completely and utterly denying, I never said that. You go, here's a video clip of you saying it. Well, that's been taken out of context. No, we played the whole clip. Like, this is an entire statement that you made. No, but that's out of context. What context changes the meaning of what you said? They make these statements because now, if it agrees with the position of, say, their base or their voting bloc, then yeah, they'll all go, oh yeah, well, I agree with that. That was a mean trick that reporter played. And they deny the reality of the situation. That's what Borges is actually exploring.
Yeah, he seems to invite it. He seems to invite that. He even says metaphysics is a branch of literature of fantasy, so he's inviting that very contradictory type of thing.
Well, there is a part actually in the story that it is said that no one believes in the reality of nouns within Uqbar. Basically, what AP said, that they will stop existing as soon as you leave the room.
Object permanence, something that we are born not having. We have no concept of object permanence when we are born. And that's why when you ever play that kid or that game with a young baby, you cover their eyes, you have disappeared. If you move out of their vision, you have ceased to exist, because they have no concept of object permanence. If they throw something out of their pram, it has ceased to exist. And then when you bring it back, it's like a magic trick. You have recreated the thing. And then we learn about object permanence, and we're like, oh, it's just out of eyesight. Like that's all that it is. But that's when you ask a kid, hide from me, and they do that, and they cover their eye because they can't see you, therefore you cannot see them. This is something that we just take for granted about our perception of reality and how we see things. Certain visible spectrum and how we hear things, certain frequencies, vibrations in the air that we interpret as sound. That ultimately these are arbitrary lines that have been drawn that give rise to our experience. But because it's a consensus amongst all humans, we sort of go, well, yeah, well, that's what this thing is. That's what reality is.
To circle back to the idea of the mirrors that Gerald mentioned, because I do that within the story, I considered at some point that it was kind of like a mirror facing another mirror. We have the mirror of reality sharing the idea of Tlön and Uqbar, and then that is mirroring the reality again, because you get all these encyclopedias with the story from it, and then people start imagining it, and it circles back, and it's like two mirrors reflecting ad infinitum each other. And it's a very interesting idea of, it is said that in Tlön you get transparent tigers and towers of blood, but it depends on whether you believe on them, if they exist or not. And that is what the people on Tlön as well believe. I don't know, I thought it was a quirky spiral of what is real and what is not, to the point that it becomes real because you're thinking of it, because you're reading of it, and you're trying to analyze it.
But also, anyone who recites a line of Shakespeare is Shakespeare. That any work, and any work written, is not signed, because as you are reading it, you are creating it. Therefore, you are the author of it. And we can see that almost that investigation of reader response theory, the answer to, or at least a counter argument to, new criticism that was focused on the text and nothing but the text. But if the text is encoded information, the other party to that is the reader, and the reader is decoding the information. Therefore, the reader is giving meaning to the text. The text does not have inherent meaning. It only has meaning when it is interpreted by a reader. And, then we get that it gets kind of softened and reduced and simplified to, the text belongs to the reader, that I have created the meaning. Well, yes and no. And this is the playfulness of something like that. When we think of the reading experience, when you read about Tolkien's Middle-earth, we know it doesn't exist. Middle-earth does not exist. But when we are reading, it kind of does, in a certain way. Frodo is not a real person. So why then do we feel worried for Frodo? Why do we feel worried for Sam? Why do we feel upset at things that happen in The Lord of the Rings? Why do we feel sadness when a tragic thing happens? Why do we feel happiness when a good thing happens? They are not real, but we give them a level of reality in how we are imagining, how we are interpreting these symbols, these abstract black symbols on a white page. We have from that constructed a reality and then are psychologically reacting to it. How is that possible? How can that work? That is part and parcel, I think, of one approach to understanding what Borges is actually playing with about this construction of a reality, because every piece of fiction is fantasy, even if it is historical fiction involving historical characters in an historical setting. It's not a documentary. It's not a recording of their life. It's fiction. It's made up. But is it less fictiony because it contains, no, it's no less a fiction. But for some bizarre reason, our brains trick ourselves into sort of going, well, this is more realistic. This is more believable than, John Carter of Mars and the Barzoom novels. You go, oh yeah, but that's not realistic. That's not real. Not in the same way that Con Iggulden's books about Caesar are real. They're equally made up. They are equally fictitious. But our brains trick us into thinking that there's there's a different level of fiction in made up fantasy stuff. And where do we draw that line?
You made me think of something, within bookworms or in general, there is this saying that you get a book hangover, that you were so into a book that by the end of it, you want to keep reading. And that is, I think, to some extent, an evidence of that juxtaposition of reality and unreality, because the characters and the story became so real to you or to the reader, and so important as well, that you want to keep reading about them, that it's impossible to believe that the story stopped.
That's you falling under the sway of Tlön. That's what that is.
Something like that. But it made me think of that if I had, as a reader, so many feelings about a story, my feelings are still real, even if the story is fantastical.
I feel we could also relate this to the own reading experience and how the same test read by two different persons could become two different experience or two different tests, because at the we are giving its own layer of reality or experience, because at the end reading is not just the words in paper but also the circumstances we are working with, because the same even the same book with the same person but in two total different situations, you can get opposite reactions just for that, which also it's interesting because maybe we can define a reality without thinking about the context or the circumstance that are related to it.
Yeah, and especially because every reader's own life experience will tarnish the meaning of the story and create that additional layer.
Yeah, because also it's interesting because in some communities, when a story is not as clear, or there are some threads that are not tied, it's interesting how each reader creates its own, well, not reality, but its own theory of how that thread continues. And I feel that's also part of what Borges could imply with this test, because at the end, Tlön exists because these persons, these people, think about it and are in the same page about the existence of this kind of place. But without this person, in reality, there's not Tlön. It's simply a concept that is devoid of meaning.
Wouldn't that be Kant's idealism? That if you imagine or believe in something, therefore it exists.
I mean, I feel it can be inspired by idealism.
And there is something at the start of the book of the story that I wanted to bring up. We have this sentence that it's roughly like a fourth wall breaking there, but it says Borges, or the main character, who was speaking with a friend, we became lengthily engaged in a vast polemic concerning the composition of a novel in the first person, which this one is, whose narrator will omit or disfigure the facts and indulge in various contradictions, which will permit a few readers, very few readers, to perceive an atrocious or banal reality. And it's like he's saying at the same time, like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm an unreliable narrator.
Well, and again, it's playing with it on that, I suppose, almost like metatextual level. Like I said at the beginning, like this is fiction pretending to be nonfiction, referring to the creation of a fictional reality that is masquerading as a reality. And in it, there's sly commentary on, but it's going to be an unreliable narration because you cannot trust what you're being told. And so it's again about this level of perception of truth, perception of reality, what is real and what is unreal. And Borges is an absolute master of undermining the certainty that quite often we like in particular types of texts. That this is something that goes to that idea of the reader experience, where, you know, when we're 12 and we read a book and we go, oh, that book was amazing and it had all of these really cool things in it, and we've imagined it. And when we're 32 and we go back to it, you go, how did I like this book? A lot of the stuff I remembered isn't actually there because our memories are fallible. Our memories play tricks. I think Gaiman once referenced, he was talking about the magic of reading and how we can remember an amazing sword fight in a book, but if we went and actually looked up the words on the page, it's 2 sentences of like, their blades clashed, he grunted with effort. But we have generated an entire scene out of that, usually because there's been a build up to it, a dramatic tension that has been built up. Then there's this, which is an explosion. We imagine it in our minds and move on. But when you have unreliable narration, when you have deliberate contradictions in a text that is questioning your perception of what is actually happening and deliberately trying to undermine it, it's messing with the reader. It's playing with that subjective reading with a subjective narrator. And narrators, unreliable narration can be either trustworthy and untrustworthy, or subjective, where they do not have all of the evidence and therefore they cannot be fully reliable, or untrustworthy because they're actually lying to you. And ordinarily, authors give you clues, but they can also play into it. And they can play into that very notion of the unreliability of any sort of personalized subjective narration, which is an absolutely fascinating concept because it demolishes, or at least undermines, our idea that the text is static and that the text is a fixed thing. Because we look at it and it is printed on the page and the words aren't going to change, but because the reader always changes, and because the information is going to be interpreted, at least some of the information is going to be interpreted subjectively, or has shades of subjectivity to it. Because we can still agree, if a character slaps another character, there's a line, that character slapped that character. We would read that line and we would all agree, yes, that character slapped that character. What meaning and feeling we attribute to it is going to be individual, whether we are upset by this action, whether we are angered by this action, whether we just glance over and go, yeah, but it's not a big deal. Whatever our reaction is will be personal, but we would still agree that that character slapped that other character. It's there in black and white on the page. So yes, there's a level of subjectivity to readership and understanding, but it's not wholly subjective. And with unreliable narration, we have to extend some level of trust in the narrator. Otherwise, why are we reading? Because if we cannot trust a single thing, what is the point in reading it? Because we need something concrete to latch onto. And of course, what he's exploring with this story and what he posits here is, no, you don't. You don't need anything concrete, because if you can conjure this illusion and you get enough belief in the illusion itself becomes real.
I mean, it's one of those things that I've got a natural sort of reaction against this whole reality being subjective. I find that very difficult to deal with. I think, reality is, and when people assign intent to other people's actions, going back to AP's point about whether people are entering a building or they are storming the building, I think, like you said, we can agree that they were outside the building and then they were in the building, and then you're assigning intent to it, but then that doesn't make anyone's interpretation right and the other people wrong, or vice versa. And you got all these things: cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, all that sort of stuff. I personally like to think that reality is fixed, and there are most things we should all agree on. And obviously, how we feel about something is obviously personal. And in terms of the story, it's just trying to say that in a very exaggerated way, that perceptions, that the fantasy can alter reality. And in the story, it does it to the extreme where these objects from this fictional world start materializing in the real world. He's just exaggerating everything. Let's not forget that the story is part of a whole collection called Ficciones. It's all fictions. He's just exploring ideas. But the ideas he explores even within the story when he's talking about the nature of language, this language where there are no nouns. All these things are so hypothetical and they are so abstract that, someone like me trying to comprehend a language without nouns I can't. Even though he gives a few examples, I just cannot imagine talking without using nouns. It's just a very exaggerated exploration of ideas.
On one of your points that you raised, that we agree on a reality, and it's maybe people's intent is being a subjective manipulation where we are imposing an intent. But if you and I both walked into the same hotel room, and you might look at it and go, oh, this hotel room's a bit shabby, and I'm looking at it going, oh, this is glorious. Now, that's based on personal experience, because the hotel rooms I can afford, this hotel room that we've walked into is absolutely amazing compared to the ones where I usually end up staying. Whereas you're looking at it going, oh, well, I usually stay in a 5-star place, and this is just below my standards. We're both looking at exactly the same room, but the reality of that room is different. And that has nothing to do with intent. That's not either one of us ascribing intent to the object of this object is doing something. It's just its natural state of being is being interpreted subjectively. And so if we take that as how we can subjectively perceive exactly the same reality, but in radically different ways, and we then extend that to any observation we make, where you and I both look at a car and I say that car is green, and you say, no, it's not, it's blue. But I'm perceiving it as green because of whatever way the light is hitting it. You're perceiving it as blue. We are at odds as to what the reality is. We would agree it's a car. We would both agree that it's a car, but we would fundamentally disagree whether it's a blue car or a green car. And that is, I think, part of what Borges is playing with. And we see like a similar sort of thing. This was an obsession of Philip K. Dick's as well. And you see it in like The Man in the High Castle or the Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And like a lot of Philip K. Dick's work it's about this perception of reality and multiple layers to reality and what we perceive. And the weird thing is, like, in some circumstances, we would agree with, oh yeah, but it's a subjective way of looking at it. And then when someone applies it to something else, we feel that instinctive, no, but there is a reality. There must be a reality, because that's I can touch this table, I can poke that person and hope they don't punch me back. We experience all of those things. And yet, if some of it is subjectively perceived, why is not all of it subjectively perceived? And if all of it is subjectively perceived, how do we know the difference between what the objective reality is and what is our subjective perception of that reality? And if we cannot tell the difference at all, then what's the difference between a subjective perception and a subjective thought? Because all we are is a brain in a biological machine, because we're not actually seeing anything. There's a little electrical signal that is going to our brain telling us that we are seeing something. We could be a brain in a jar. We wouldn't know. And suddenly you start doubting the nature of reality. I think that's a lot of what Borges is playing with. And it's one of those, he is one of those authors that challenges notions that we accept as common sense. To go, what are the underpinnings of your common sense? And you go, oh, well, clearly it's this thing. And then you start scratching at the surface. The way that he does, he just starts scratching at the surface. And the next thing you know, you've gouged holes in the table. You're down in a hole. You're looking at the world going, everything's a lie, because he makes you doubt existence.
Yeah, he tells you that along the way. He tells you that this is an ambiguous interpolation. He tells you that some of it is an imposter, and he continually tells you that over and over again, to the point where he gets to the end of the story and you're wondering whether in this fictional telling, the story that was supposed to be non-fictional in a fictional way is being invaded by reality that's not so. That's unreality. He actually says unreality is a mirror reflection of reality, and he keeps bringing that up. He makes you go down the rabbit hole of wondering. It's funny how he does that.
A question that comes up with this: when we have adaptations of books, or when we have franchises, and there's a companion book like the Encyclopedia of A Song of Ice and Fire, or the maps of A Song of Ice and Fire, and we look at it and go, oh, and that map's wrong. How is the map wrong? Oh, well, that's not how that happened. You go, how what happened? The thing in the fictional thing that didn't actually happen. It's fiction. We have that reaction of, no, but in the book it said that thing. But in this book, it's now saying it differently. You've changed. So you go, but none of it is real. None of it is reality. None of it is fixed. But oh no, but it's a pseudo reality. And we're into that really weird thing about constructions and understandings of lore or canon. Something we borrow from religions to describe the frameworks and rules of a world, canon. And we look at that. We look at these encyclopedias, the Tolkien Bestiary, that outlines all of this information about the creatures of Tolkien's world. And then maybe like 20 years later, some of the notes that Tolkien get published. You go, well, what is real now? The thing that has been out in this bestiary for all of this time that was based on one set of notes. What makes that less or more authentic than the other set? Oh, well, Tolkien wrote that. You go, but Tolkien had multiple versions for where orcs were created, how orcs were created. Which one is the authentic one? Or are they all equally authentic? If they're all equally authentic, are they all equally real? We have that construction of, we create fictional atlases. We create fictional encyclopedias that map fictional worlds and fictional societies. And what's the difference between that and someone from a colonial power writing the entry for the Encyclopedia Britannica about a conquered nation and deciding what those people are, what their culture is, and noting it down? And that, I think, is one of the really powerful takeaways of this. That, we can talk about it in terms of pop culture and literature, but when we actually think of the fundamentals, the principles that are being applied, and we apply it to the real world of how the people that are writing down what our cultures are, what our histories are the ones who are shaping that reality. Because then that is recorded. That is now real because it's in the book. And when other people read it, and you can say, oh no, but that's not how it happened. Well, that's what the book says. I can cite the book. Your memory is wrong. Oh, well, you would have that position because you're biased. Oh, well, that's not what I read. That is actually an incredibly frightening aspect of this malleability of reality. Because once it's written down, once it's recorded, why did Borges pick an encyclopedia? Why did he pick this as a text that we go to for the truth, for the information about something? And what is it describing? A fictional country in the Middle East, in Turkey sort of area. Why that? Why pick a country that most of his readers will not have visited? Because that's how we understand that country. The people living there are going, how can these idiots believe this? But think of all of those things that we look up on Wikipedia. And that's how we understand a situation, because we looked up the summary that is based on someone's notes. We can look at we can do proper research, go to the actual sources, and then trace those sources back. But ultimately, what we're working along are these subjective perceptions that may have been written at a time or in a place or by a person with a specific agenda, with a specific view of what the reality is, with not just subjectivity, but ideological reasons to do the thing. And we have no way of knowing when we read that, is it real or is it fiction? And I think that's part of what Borges is doing with this short story.
I think one of the things I had difficulty with in the story as a whole was trying to figure out what it's about, what the underlying connecting thread is, because parts of it I could map to the real world and say, okay, this bit is like that. And I think after Library of Babel, I was looking for the physics connections more than anything else. But I couldn't find that connecting thread until we got to the postscript, where he talked about the fact that the history of Tlön is what is taught in schools, and people have now decided that this is the history of the world. And that was the bit that spoke to me of something that is currently happening in at least my country, perhaps other parts of the world, where history is being rewritten, reinterpreted, and spread through WhatsApp university, as we call it. So basically, there's a glorification of the past or a reconstruction of the past, and that is taught as what is real. And so I think, and then rereading all of the stuff that came before in that context, I think really helped. And that was the primary connecting thread. But everything all of you said helped build more on top of that. It is definitely, I think, exploring. I had to look up papers to find this, but it's something that it is in support of idealism. Others think it's a refutation of idealism. But apparently, Borges takes philosophical concepts and then explores, like, builds out worlds based on that. That part of it is there. But also, I think the bits that really spoke to me were the ones that connect to the world, like everything that you said, AP, about the things that tend to be in our minds, even though we think they have physical reality, like the boundaries of nations and stuff. But also, I think the rewriting of history, the construction of like the glorification of a past that potentially doesn't exist. I think those were the things that stood out to me there.
Well, at the end of the day, that rewriting of history is very characteristic of Argentina. And Borges wrote this story in 1940. Granted, it was before a lot of things happened that further the rewriting of history, but at the same time, something that has characterized the country. And he was publishing on his own magazine, Publicaciones Sur, I think. He was banned a few times for publishing things that were politically interpreted. The first story that we discussed, A House Taken Over from Cortázar, it was published on Borges magazine and it was banned because it was understood to have a specific political connotation regarding the rewriting of history. And if you look at the country in 2024, you can see that Argentinians, we cannot agree on very specific things about history. I'm not going to go deeply into that, but there is a particular success that has affected a number of people, and that number of people is being discussed over and over because, oh, it is written in this place that it is this number, is written in this other place that is this number, and the number became an icon. It stopped being real. And I think this story also goes into that, discussing the history of Argentina in a very covert way.
On that, then, could the story be interpreted as a cautionary tale of what the power of these conspiracies, for want of a better word, could do to society? And if it could be interpreted that way, then the follow-up question is, what could you do to prevent it, or how could you go about it?
The problem that I see is currently, again in 2024, how much information we have available. It's very difficult to check your sources. And circling back to what AP said, if a winner writes history, then how can we be sure that our quote-unquote truthful source of information is actually truthful?
Well, the very first thing is anyone who is called victor is no longer allowed to write history, because, history is written by the victors and they've done a terrible job at it. This is a really difficult question. We live in an age with a super saturation of stuff, and learning how to pare away what is disinformation, misinformation, partial information, stuff that can be relied upon. That is becoming more and more difficult because there is just so much and it is so complex that I honestly don't think there's very much that we can do to forestall this. And it is only going to be exacerbated by the emergence of generative AI. That is going to make things 1,000 times worse because deep fakes of videos generated with real 3D, almost like live action perfect, with the right voice that they'll make whatever script that they want to say it. We're no longer going to be able to trust our eyes with anything that we see that's electronic. So we have to go back then to what's being published. But and it is the one downside to self-publishing. Anyone can now self-publish. So someone can go, oh, I've published all of these things. I've published 30 books, therefore I am an expert on them. And 30 books that were all AI generated trash, but it's too late. They already have, I have 30 books. And so this is going to become harder and harder to discern and to pick apart what can be trusted and what can't be trusted. Conspiratorial thinking. Think of the rise of various conspiracy theories from the early 2000s to now. In the early 2000s, yeah, there have always been some conspiracy theories. And we kind of looked at them and went, yes, wear your tinfoil hat, sit over there, be quiet. There's a small group of it. But people genuinely believe it because we are getting worse and worse at being able to discern fact from fiction. This is a skill we are losing. And it's not just on us individually. It's also about the media we consume. News stories purporting to be news and factual that are all ideological spin say that they are factual. We are reporting the news. You go, that is no longer news, but that is now how we are getting our news, from very biased ideological sources. And this is happening in multiple countries, not just one.
It's happening, yeah. And it's happening in universities too. Do you ever hear of Bob Jones University? They put out specific literature that subverts actual history, and they're selling it to homeschools and other universities of like minds. And it's happening all over the place, that kind of thing.
And this is why I think very small things, and we can, to give you an example from something that is wildly unimportant. The trailer for a movie comes out, and suddenly you will have a bunch of YouTubers and online critics who are, this is terrible, this is trash, and the film hasn't come out yet. No one has seen the film yet. They're not even going, I think the film will be. It's no, this film is. It is already assumed that. And therefore they design arguments ahead of time so that when the thing actually comes out, people go in with that mindset and therefore are looking for those things specifically. Because they are primed to look for the things, they find the things. Therefore, oh, well, that's why it was bad. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, that is on an incredibly small and minor scale, because at the end of the day, they're films. It's popular entertainment. That's not world ending. But this we are finding with news, with current events, with perceptions of other people, with history, with how we treat one another, that these things, these narratives, these perceptions are shaping the very reality of things in the real world. Because once we start down that conspiratorial mindset, once we start engaging with that, it can leach into other aspects of our lives. We find ourselves repeating phrases. If we hear them often enough, we end up repeating them. And if we're repeating them and using them, that actually shapes how we think about the thing. Think of, back in the 90s in the UK, there was this huge thing about, political correctness. Oh, it's absolutely terrible. How dare you tell me I'm not allowed to refer to that person as a policeman, that I have to call them a police officer? You go, right, what's the job? The job is police officer. The job is not gendered. Level of bias toward female police officers over time has decreased. Why? Because we see them as police officers who are female, rather than going, oh, policeman's the real one, and then there's the woman police officer, the WP, the woman police constable, as something different, something other, something lesser. And language shapes that. Language can shape thought. If language shapes thought, and thought is how we perceive reality, language is shifting our perception of reality, and we start to bring into life a consensus reality based on those shared thoughts. I think we've drifted a lot from the story, but this story is investigating these very...
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah. I think the story could be used as a critical thinking tool to teach that very kind of thing. And a lot of fantasy in general can be used as a tool to teach that kind of thing.
Isn't the internet just the encyclopedia of Tlön? Pretty much.
Pretty much.
Pretty much, yeah.
Just a vast number of people working together to create alternate histories. Except it's not as consistent as the Encyclopedia of Tlön apparently is.
It's like we have this amazing invention where we can share our best ideas, our most creative ideas, then some of human knowledge and experience. We can share that, or no, that's not what we're going to use it.
There's a great line in this story that kind of reflects that. And it says that you have these many men that adept all these diverse disciplines, but few capable of imagination, and fewer still capable of subordinating imagination to a rigorous and systemic plan. And I really love that line. And that kind of reflects your view of the internet, and how it's not really used to its potential at all.
Oh, it's used to its potential in that we now have instantaneous spread of information of a certain type across the world. Like it's utilizing its potential, but for an end and the mean of something we don't actually want, that is not beneficial to humankind. But at the same time, look at what we are able to do. We can have live discussions from multiple places in the world without racking up I think I remember back in the day, like having a half-hour phone call to Canada would be an astronomical phone bill. And my mum remembers having to book a time to make the phone call because there were a limited number of international lines. We have now moved to, we can have these instantaneous chats. That this is amazing. But that amount of information, how do we know what we can trust? And we come back to this question that is part of what Borges is exploring. How do we know what we can trust? How do we know what is real? Even bigger, what does reality mean? Is reality what we can touch? And you go, well, no, because there are lots of things that we can't touch that we would still describe as real. So what is reality? What is this thing that we are talking about? What is this concept? Because language shapes our ability to think about it. And language is an imperfect tool to encapsulate the human experience. It cannot do it. Otherwise, mathematicians would just work in words. They don't. They've invented an entire language for physics and different branches of mathematics because it's the only way that they can accurately express the things that they are trying to express. Because words do not do it justice. There's too much ambiguity. There's too much flexibility. It's not rigorous enough. And when it comes to literature, to knowledge, to how we assimilate all these things, that being aware of that mushiness, that non-specificity, and we try to be as specific as possible, but there's always going to be a softness to the information. And even if we see it with our own eyes, even if we are the witness to something, we are seeing it from one point of view, and we're not seeing it from 360 degrees, or we can't see and know everything. We have a very limited perspective and window into the world. Unreliable narration, presenting some things as factual, things that are clearly non-factual next to it, but presented in the same tone and in the same manner. And we start to blur those distinctions. Borges uses those tricks to give it authenticity, to give it weight, where he talks about, they find these artifacts. And if you notice, that whole experiment that they said that they performed, the one that worked was where the person who knew it shouldn't have worked wasn't there. Therefore, it was a pure assumption that the things would be there. That's why they found it. Or is it? Was it simply that they dug up somewhere that happened to have these things? Because lo and behold, we build our cities and settlements on top of other cities and settlements. And eventually, if you dig up enough riverbeds, you're going to find stuff because it's a riverbed. These things will happen, whether it's statistically or whether it's because of selection, or as he implies, he creates that implication because of the sequence of events. Oh, the people who knew it shouldn't have worked were overseeing it. That's why it didn't work. But he never specifically says that. But when the guy dies, the conclusion is drawn for you without being stated. We as reader read into that. We interpret it. We go, oh, it's because that guy died, and therefore his thought that this shouldn't have worked isn't interfering with their thought that it should, and that's why they find this stuff. And you go, that is magical thinking. But he makes us believe that. He sets us up for that because he knows how readers react to the sequence and order of information. That is some of the brilliance about his writing, is he knows how readers interpret stuff. He is so good at manipulating that. He's a fantastic author.
And also timeless, because Borges' writing can be read and read and read and reinterpreted as the time goes on and in different ages, and it will still have meaning, because I doubt that he actually could have imagined internet to exist, yet it applies perfectly.
But even our construction of who Borges is, you go, depending on what we know of his life and when he lived and our perception of when he lived and the area in which he lived, that shapes our understanding of him. But that's not him. That's a version of him at a specific point in time. And again, to go back to that, the painting of the pipe, it's when we start mistaking the replication or the reflection or the copy of a thing for the thing itself. We do it a lot. We make these to say, oh, it's close enough. It's not quite the same, but it's basically the same. And at what point does it no longer become the same? If you keep chipping away at that for each iteration. And that's what he says about those items that are created. That, what is it? When it gets to the 12th generation, they have somewhat faded. And you think of it as with a photocopier, like the first copy you made, but then if you copy the copy and you copy the copy over and over again, old photocopiers, it used to get more and more fuzzy and the letters would fade and the whole thing would become grayed out because of the dust and the specks and the errors that would get replicated and exaggerated. That's kind of what we have here about information passed through time, a copy of a copy of a copy. And when does it cease to be even a reflection of the real thing and become something entirely? Where is that dividing line? And we like neat, precise lines. We like those, but that's not what life has. Life is not full of those lines, those neat divisions. Life is so much more complex, but we struggle with that because we like the box. Well, what is this writing? What is this story? It talks about a fictional planet and this whole thing. And is this science fiction? Is it fantasy? Is it science fantasy? Is it magic realism? Is it postmodern literature? Is it all of them? Is it none of them? The thing is, we want the box because the box makes it nice and neat, instead of going, like, this is just a weird story and it's a brilliant story. Just read it.
The sequence where 11th iteration is somehow purer than the first, that also felt like a bit of a metaphor for, I think, the races who consider themselves a pure version of what came before, like the Aryans. We are the Aryans. It's like we are somehow purer than the people we originated from, and like we collect the purest forms. That feels like a bit of a stretch, but also it made me think of that. The last iteration is purer than the first one.
So this one is a bit of a trivia, but we have this curious part in which the narrator says it is conjectured that this brave new world is the work of a secret society. And I found that interesting because when I read it in Spanish, Brave New World is written in English. I thought it could be a reference to the book by Aldous Huxley, and I went in to check some dates. Brave New World was published in 1932 and Tlön Uqbar in 1940. So it actually adds up if we consider how slow it was publishing back then. But do you think that this is a reference?
To me, it's got to be, because it's a strange conjunction of words to just be a brave new world is a very peculiar construction, and the fact that he's using it in English in the original Spanish text, when I read it as well, straight away my mind went there. Now it seems obvious. Maybe back in the day it probably wasn't.
It's a famous quotation from Shakespeare. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it.
That's my ignorance speaking. There you go.
No, but and that's why Huxley used it for his story, because John Savage, of course, has read the complete works of Shakespeare. That was the only piece of literature he had, and he read the works of Shakespeare over and over again. So when he goes to the city, oh, brave new world that has such people in it. But it's a very famous quotation from Shakespeare, from The Tempest.
So did Borges quote Shakespeare, or did he quote Huxley quoting Shakespeare?
Well, as we all know from this story, anyone who quotes Shakespeare is Shakespeare. So he was Shakespeare when he said
That's right.
it.
It's the 11th iteration of Shakespeare.
And therefore the purest form of Shakespeare.
Well, you need to hear it in its original Klingon. I don't think it's necessary to try and say exactly where Borges got it, because he could have gotten it from Huxley's text, or he could have gotten it from Shakespeare, or any number of any other places. It's the resonance of that line, and it's presumably why it was printed in English, because it is the line from Shakespeare to be recognized. And then depending on the translation, I don't know if there's an official translation into either Portuguese or Spanish for Shakespeare's work, if there's an official one, or if there are multiple translations.
And the other question that I had is, this is also a note that in Tlön, and he goes to some extent in this, southern and northern languages are different, and that because they have different languages, they see the world differently. In particular, the narrator says that the literature from the southern hemisphere abounds in ideal objects. I thought it could be a reference to how different the cultures from both hemispheres are, especially if we consider that Argentina is in the southern hemisphere and it had a very different view of the world compared to Europe. The story was published in 1940, 1941 during World War II in a country that did not participate. It didn't send troops, it only sent food supplies, right? So it had, by definition at that time, a very different view or perception of what was happening. The war in itself took a different, or had a different reality for Argentinians because they didn't participate. And I thought it tied back to that idea of what is real and what is not, simply because in here he seemed to be making a commentary against real geopolitics.
I think that's a very strong reading of it. Like, when you look at a map, why is north at the top? Why is north top? It just is.
Because we decided it. We agreed on it, and that's it.
But you could put north at the bottom. It's just a direction. And so if we put north at the top, northern countries become more important because they're at the top of the dock. And then the southern countries, the southern hemisphere, they're less important. They're lesser. They're below. We represent this. We look at how the dominance of European nations on the rest of the world, for a lot of the world, how they colonized and changed and shaped, and it was their view of reality that was being imposed. So there was a separation between the northern reality and the southern reality. When you look at what happened to the countries of South America and Central America, of, oh yeah, people, we're living here, this is our country, this is our life, and then someone turning up going, yes, but I have a flag, do you have a flag? This is now my land. I think that's a wonderful way to look at it, because I think it ties into that notion of, it's the Encyclopedia Britannica. That's the source of this knowledge. Why is it the source of knowledge?
Although, one thing that caught my attention there, it isn't quite the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's the American version of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I was like, oh, is he having a dig there? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like,
That's a brilliant point. Authenticity. What is real? What is the original? If it's exactly the same, word for word, page by page, if it is exactly the same, does it make any difference which one it is?
But they're not exactly the same, because it mentions that the American version has got like this extra 4 pages, or however many pages it is, which is the one that contains all the knowledge that we had about it.
When they went to get other editions of it, they couldn't find it in the other editions of exactly the same printing, that it was this one special version that they found. And again, I think it goes to that point, because, oh yeah, I don't know if you've ever been to any of the war museums in Normandy, and they may have changed since I was there. I was there when I was quite young. We went on a trip to France, and we went into one of the museums, and they had a documentary playing, and it was every 15 minutes it would change language. And it played in Francais, Deutsch, Espanol, American. And we go, hang on a sec, French, German, Spanish, American. No. American isn't the language. It's English would be the language. The majority of English speakers who went there would be Americans visiting because of the beach landings. And it was one of the ones that was actually quite close to where a lot of the American troops landed. So that's why it said American, the majority of their tourists. But there was that, even as a child, I was, that slightly, hang on a sec, that's wrong. It should be English. And then I'm going, hang on a sec, I'm Irish. Why am I even worried about this? And there is this sort of authority of correctness, of fact, of authenticity that is sort of baked into my culture, the Anglo-Irish sort of culture of, and it's something we struggle against, but also it is part of us, about this sort of hierarchy. Jose, that was a brilliant point, that it is the American edition, which is somehow lesser, and yet if it's exactly the same, or Maybe it just doesn't have the letter U in as many words. But if it's exactly the same, why is there that distinction?
I actually had a different interpretation, and this is because I'm quote unquote in the future from that story when that story was written. But America ended up being quite important in the 80s and the 90s in reshaping South American history. And if we consider the Operation Condor, which at the end of the day changed the history and the political past of two countries, I was saying, like, did he check the future or what? Because if we read it now, it has a completely different meaning, probably from what he was intending back then.
And that goes to the wonderful flexibility of abstract notions and how we understand and apply them. Back in the 1980s, Rambo 3 came out. John Rambo is drafted in, he goes to Afghanistan, and because the Russians are there and the Russians are the bad guys, and he hooks up with the Mujahideen to take down the Russians. And it was this all-American patriotic action movie. Fast forward a few years and the Cold War tensions had eased. Russia was then seen as an ally, but the Mujahideen had led to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda led to ISIS, and the CIA being involved in the training of the Mujahideen in order to defeat the Russians in a proxy war suddenly had spawned these other groups. And so post 9/11, watching Rambo 3 had a completely different resonance, because here was this all-American hero going in to ally with ostensibly the people responsible for 9/11. And then fast forward another few years with the rise of Vladimir Putin and the tensions between America and Russia escalating again. The reading of that film has changed dramatically over time, depending on the current geopolitical position. It's one of those ones that is so stark when you watch it to realize how geopolitics shapes our perception of the thing. I find that one a fascinating example, and it ties in with what I've been blathering on about this story, about this perception of reality being shaped and changed by our consensus reality.
Thank you everyone for joining. This was such a terrific discussion. Let's do a round of outros so that the listeners know where to find you.
Well, thank you very much for having me again. I mean, these conversations are never easy from an intellectual point of view, Livia. I can be found on the Jose's Amazing Worlds YouTube channel and the Fantasy Talks Live podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Livia, for inviting me. This was fun. I am on the Fantasy Thinker YouTube channel, and I am also on Speculative Speculations podcast. Check it out.
You can find me on the YouTube channel Reading by the Rainy Mountain, the podcast Speculative Speculations, and Haunting the Patreon forums. And yes, thank you so much for having me on this conversation. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. And I would like to apologize to everyone else for how much I talked. I am so sorry. I hadn't realized how much I was rambling on. But thank you very much. If people aren't already sick of my voice, I do have a YouTube channel, A Critical Dragon.
That said, if you like the episode, please like and subscribe, and let's continue the discussion in the comments. Also, if you want to get bite-sized deep dives, prose analysis, and other bookish discussions, then subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description box. Thanks for listening, and happy reading!